Professor Flowers, I need to go back to where we finished in the last examination. What if your understanding of what quote-unquote Calvinists believe about judicial hardening is false? Would that not completely undercut everything you've presented this evening?
If it's not a distinction without a difference, no. And that's what my contention is that Calvinists try to make a distinction between what they think is judicial hardening. For example, they say things like, well, they're not as evil as they could be. They're not as bad as they could be. God restrains them. And I've never understood that concept, because if God determines all things that come to pass, what's He restraining except His own determinations? And so what I think is happening is the Calvinist is making an assertion that yes, there's a difference between judicial hardening and total inability, but there's a distinction without a difference, because I have not heard any Calvinist say that mankind is born able to see, hear, understand, and turn, and so as to be healed. Instead, they say the condition of a man is unable to be able to see, hear, understand, unless they're given a new heart and new eyes.
So you now do recognize that we do specifically recognize the difference between being born dead in sin and the specific act of God of judicial hardening, which obviously has something to do with God as judge, bringing a particular hardening for a particular purpose. We do you just simply don't understand it.
And I look forward during your presentation to make it clear to the audience what that distinction is between someone who is judicially hardened by God, their ability to respond to God's revelation, as opposed to the natural born man, because I have yet to find any distinction worth a difference from any Calvinistic scholars with regard to judicial hardening.
Professor Flowers, you said that Clement, you quoted from Clement of Rome, yes?
Yes, sir.
And you said we have a lot of his writings. Did you list them?
List them all?
Isn't the fact that we have one epistle of Clement to the Corinthians, and the rest are pseudo-Clements?
Thus,
right?
although we are born neither good nor bad, we become one or the other, and having formed habits, we are with difficulty drawn from them.
Yeah, that's the quote. But you said we have lots of his writings.
I've got 5 more. You want me to read them?
No.
Okay.
Where are they from, sir?
Clement.
Okay, so we have one epistle. Did he exegete Romans 9 in that epistle?
No. Not that I know of. We've got quotes that support his view of free will. We've got quotes that denounce the concept of individualistic, Calvinistic type of interpretations.
As you interpret it.
Irenaeus and others.
As you interpret it.
Well, obviously,
okay,
yes.
All right. You said that Calvinists...
But Dr. White, not only as I interpret it, as Lorraine Botner interprets it, Stan Storms interprets it, I could list other Calvinists who admit that Augustine's the first one to clearly teach
So you can show me where they've interpreted Clement's epistle to the to the Corinthians.
No, what I'm saying is that I have quotes from other Calvinists who admit that Augustine is the first one to clearly...
Which would be different than the application you're making. They wouldn't agree with the application you're making, right?
Oh, no. They would probably try to say that, well, Sam Storms, for example, argues in progressive revelation that we have learned more since that time, and that we're continually learning. At least the podcast, the Unplugged podcast, those guys talking, that's what they
Have you read all of Clement, sir?
I'm sorry?
Have you read all of Clement?
No, I've not.
Okay. Would you be surprised to discover he speaks often of the elect?
Well, so does the Bible. That doesn't mean it would obviously...
So he must have understood it in your way.
Well, how do you interpret then the passage that I just quoted? The one that says everyone has free will. How do you interpret that?
You can ask me that question when it's your turn to ask questions, sir.
Darn. Thought it would work.
You said that Calvinists confuse the call of Paul with the call to salvation. As a former Calvinist, could you provide some examples of this from R.C. Sproul, myself? Since I'm the one you're debating this evening, can you show anyone where I have ever made that confusion?
I don't have any quotes available, but I can provide some quotes where I think pointing to Paul and the Damascus Road experience and the effectual nature of his calling is used quite often by Calvinists, and I would be glad to provide those on my podcast at a later time or on my blog if you'd like me to quote those. That's not what I was asking. Very clearly, I have distinguished between Paul's call to be an apostle and the fact that he was set apart from his mother's womb and recognized that the one demands the other, but we recognize the difference. You say we're conflating them. Is that your argument? Yes. I believe you think that God is in some ways saving men in the same way that He saves and calls out His apostles, because He has a remnant to accomplish His purpose through Israel. And His promise will not fail. So, for example, in Jonah's situation, God could have just used irresistible means to make him want to go, but He uses a big fish. He could have just irresistibly made Paul want to believe and do what He wanted him to do, but He uses a blinding light. And I think we all agree He uses means. But in my perspective, I think that means actually accomplish what the Scriptures say that they accomplish. In other words,
but God
the
could have
means
failed.
are unto faith.
But He could have failed. Paul could have said no, yes?
He able but not willing. Calvinists use that term all the time. He's able, but he wasn't willing.
But He could have.
He was able but not willing.
Okay. So if He had, then God would have had to have found someone else other than Paul.
Well, I'm not denying God's foreknowledge. I'm not denying God's abilities to know what His plans are. And again,
so if God knew, then He couldn't have, right?
I'm sorry?
If God knew, then He couldn't have. Or God's foreknowledge could have been invalidated, right?
Well, God foreknows the free choice. He doesn't foreknow His determination. And that's the distinction philosophically that I really don't want to go down that road. Not because
I can understand that, yeah.
I let William Lane Craig take that one.
He won't do it either. Well, he won't. You said that you can't trust a God who has two wills. God said, "Thou shalt not murder," right?
Correct.
Is that the will of God?
Yes.
In Acts 4:27 and 28, was the early church wrong to pray and to confess that what Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Jews and the Romans did, God's hand and purpose predestined to occur, which was specifically the murder of the only innocent man who has ever lived?
Yeah, I wrote a blog article on this, the three main texts that Calvinists often refer to. Genesis chapter 50, the selling of the brothers. Obviously, Israel being hardened, as Pharaoh was hardened, is a big one. And then again, the crucifixion of Christ. And as I've reminded in my podcast and other places, we do believe God determines some things. God does step into human history, and very similar to what maybe even compatibilistic arguments are, and how God works these things out through judicial hardening, that He brings about His purpose. So He blinds the Israelites in order to do what? To ensure the crucifixion. And so, yes, God does determine some things, but it's for a redemptive purpose, like the cop hiding himself. It's for the redemptive plan. It's not to condemn them, because they too could be saved. It's not a condemning from birth to death.
Was Herod condemned for his actions in the death of Christ?
I would assume so.
Pontius Pilate?
I would assume so, yes.
Was it eternally God's intention for the cross to take place?
Well, I think the word intention gets misapplied. Because when we say intention, you talk about God having the intention of the evil happening, where I talk about God's redemptive intention in the evil happening. And so there's a distinction. Michael Brown and you go around and around about this too, where God is redeeming an evil for good, and he's taking their evil intention and turning it around. He's redeeming that evil intention for a good thing. And in His meticulous providence, He's able to do that. But in His sovereign abilities, He's able to do that. But that doesn't mean, from my perspective, that we deny human responsibility in the ability to respond and make real choices within time and space.
Let me try it again. Was it God's intention from eternity that the Son of God become incarnate and die upon Calvary's tree? I don't think you answered that question.
Well, I was defining the word intention. And
all right.
Yes,
if you'd like to use, was it His will? Was it the choice of the triune God? Use whatever term you wish. But did God intend in eternity past for the second person of the Trinity to enter into flesh and die upon Calvary's tree?
And that's what I was attempting to answer in saying that proof that God uses determinative, if you want to call them that, determinative means to bring about the redemption of all mankind does not prove that God also uses deterministic means to bring about all the sins that need redeeming. That's my argument, is that sometimes people look at Calvary and they say, well, God used determinative means to bring about Calvary, so He must have brought about all the sin that was being redeemed at Calvary. And that to me is a gross overstatement of what the cross is. The cross is called by Calvinists the worst evil of all time, but the Bible never calls it the evil. The Bible calls it redemption. God is giving up His own life. He's stepping in. He's self-sacrificially giving Himself, much like Paul expresses at the beginning of this chapter, willing to sacrifice Himself for the sake of his brethren.
That is time